Good morning. I have to move the camera this way so you won't see my bed. So, who is the God of Israel? At the heart of any Jewish theology is the doctrine of God. Jews and Christians worship the same God. For Christians, it is essential to have a correct understanding of God, his attributes, his ways, and his teachings. Christians, however, frequently have a greatly diminished and shallow picture of God. This is largely due to their unfamiliarity with the Old Testament, or the Tanakh, as is the Hebrew term for the Old Testament. For most Christians, our starting point is usually the teachings of Jesus and Paul. While these major figures of the New Testament were Jews and thus their teachings are largely grounded in Judaism, Christians often miss the rich context of the Jewish scriptures out of which their teachings emerge. By way of example, every word in the Lord's Prayer spoken by Jesus to his disciples has an Old Testament origin. You can read the Lord's Prayer in Matthew chapter 6, 9 to 13. Similarly, Paul's teachings in Romans 4 and Galatians 3 about the significance of Abraham cannot be properly grasped without a careful reading of Genesis 12, chapters 12 to 25. If Christianity starts with the God of Abraham and the patriarchs believing response to that God, every Christian should be driven back to the Old Testament, where their theology and faith is firmly rooted. Read Galatians 3:29. A note on the names of God in the Torah or Pentateuch, or the first 5 books of the Tanakh. Several names for God are used, which has led to an erroneous theology called the documentary hypothesis, JEPD, which says that the Torah was a construct of at least 4 authors and not Moses, because each author calls their God by a different name. It is very apparent that these scholars from the German theological school do not know Hebrew. If they knew Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, they would have known the errors of their thinking. I will do in depth the names of God in another video. So if the JEPD hypothesis were correct, then Genesis 1, chapter 1, verse 1 would be from E, the Elohist source, author, because God's name is Elohim here. So in Hebrew it is, we're trying to say it in Hebrew, Bereshit bara Elohim et ha-shimayim v'et haaretz. In the beginning, God, Elohim, created the heavens and the earth. But according to JPD, Genesis 1 verse 1 is priestly. I don't know how or why. And Genesis 1 verses 2 and 3 are Deuteronomic. So here in the first 3 sentences of Genesis 1, we have 2 authors writing at least 300 years apart. Oh, sure, that's very believable. Now we have an even more bizarre verse, Exodus 6:2. The exact verse as it appears in Common English translation is, "And God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am the Lord." But the original Hebrew verse uses 2 different names for God, Elohim and Jehovah. So its literal word for word partial translation in kind of Hebrew is, "And Elohim spoke to Moses and said to him, I am Jehovah." This is Exodus 6:2. So if JEPD is correct, there were 2 authors responsible for this one sentence. But the more important issue is, what is the significance of 2 names of God? appearing in one sentence. It is only apparent in the Hebrew. This indicates how important it is to learn biblical Hebrew. After all, churches are trying to teach the Jewishness of Jesus and Paul, and we can only appreciate it in studying biblical Hebrew. So going back to Exodus 6:2, why the use in this short verse of two names of God, Elohim and Jehovah? In biblical Hebrew, names are extremely important. In biblical Hebrew, the text is extremely precise. Every word is chosen. It's not like rhetoric that we throw it in. So it is, and Jewish scholars have looked at every word in the Hebrew and questioned it. Why is this here? Why is it there? So there is a key to understanding the names and the words. And the key is, if you read throughout the Bible and you come up with this question of a word, or why is Elohim used and why is Jehovah used in this context, one has to go back to see where that word or name appeared first, okay? And that is the context for explaining throughout the document what that word, if used, will mean. So you have to go back to first causes. So if you see that in the beginning, Elohim created the heavens and the earth. So here you have to see Elohim is used the first time. So further use of Elohim throughout the document would have to be explained in that context. So what is Elohim in the first line of Genesis? He's the creator God. So when Elohim is used later, the depiction of him as the creator God, the God of nature, must be followed. That is the key. So Elohim therefore signifies God's presence in the universe, in the law of nature, comprising that part of humankind life where no free will can be exercised. So Elohim signifies nature laws that humans have no choice but to obey, since violation implies instant penalty, like jumping off a roof or putting your hand into the fire. That is the law of nature. It is not like it can be changed. You will be hurt. And what about Jehovah? God's presence in the world, as represented by Jehovah, is revealed as traits outside of laws of nature. Here is not the God of nature where the rules of nature are present. Here is the God of morals, where there is free will. You can choose to obey or not to obey. So God's presence in the world, Jehovah, as represented by Jehovah, is revealed as traits outside of the laws of nature. Jehovah is the moral God, merciful, gracious, slow to anger, abundant in grace and truth, maintaining grace to thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. Here, free will can be exercised to accept or reject Jehovah, combining the two concepts of God, that which is the source of creation, Elohim, and that which is the source of morality, Jehovah, is the greatest message of the Torah. Combining the two sources together, the Torah declares in no uncertain terms that the two are one and the same. And Elohim spoke to Moses and said to him, I am Jehovah. Exodus 6:2. I hope you will be enamored with the Old Testament and to read it and maybe study a little biblical Hebrew too. What little I know has really fascinated me and really improved my understanding and love for Jehovah.